Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. This program is an initiative by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. As you are aware, our domain is cultural studies, and we have already completed 3 modules in our deliberations on various concepts, theories, formulations, sites of cultural studies. I welcome you to module 4, which we may entitle Culture Industries, Cultural Forms, and it is this module is slightly of a more miscellaneous nature, really, to be honest, when compared to the other modules. In the sense that the last 2 lectures of these modules would be devoted to, sort of a winding up of all that we have discussed so far. I would also, like to add some sort of a review or, a critical assessment of what we have done in these virtual classes, pointing out to some of, the points regarding the limitations of cultural studies, as a methodology that have been pointed to out, and we cannot, afford not to look at these even as we try to better our discipline. Also, part of, this module will comprise a couple of lectures on virtuality, on virtual culture, since this is one area we are already beginning to inhabit, even if some of us are in the third world countries. The first few lectures would be devoted to culture industry, cultural forms like media, form like commodity, for instance, television, right? So let's move ahead and do a recap of what we have done so far as the last module and the last lecture are concerned. Well, you will remember that module 3 was devoted to sites of cultural studies, in which we saw that we could call, aspects of cultural study like body, space, time, ethnicity, development, globalization, biology, etc. We could term these sites in the sense that these are concepts, all right, I agree, but importantly, these are also sites or locations, where culture happens, where we see the working out of culture, we see how we may describe culture, build discourses around these topics, right? By borrowing concepts that we looked at in the previous module, that is a module before the 3rd module, which was entitled Key Concepts, right? So, for instance, we found that when we consider time, as a site of cultural studies, we find that there is a movement away from the traditional concepts of time as teleological or having an end, a designed end or designated end. We also saw that time in the traditional framework was considered evolutionary in nature, and there was a linearity, time as an arrow, It was considered in a linear sort of fashion, right? It was, we could say, quite an unproblematized way of looking at time. Then we found, particularly through Michel Foucault and his genealogical approach, that time indeed may also be seen as something that is non-teleological, where events don't move on in a march to a designated telos or end. We also saw through Foucault that history may be considered not in a neat linear narrative, but as entangled events, deviations, haphazard, call it a haphazard history, and where there is also room for errors and reappraisals. Okay, so this is these are two points we saw as far as time as site is concerned. Then we looked at space, right? Space was also a site for us, and we found that space is really not just a physical given, not just topography. Okay, space is also a social construction. In that, space has to do with work, family, leisure, consumption, privacy, and all these are matters of culture or ways of living, right? Space is therefore cultural. This is what we saw, and space is therefore, according to us, a site in which we see the workings of culture, right? The last lecture was devoted to biology as a site, and even though we did take up the biological approach in module 1, in I think lectures 3, 4 and 5, where we looked at things like evolutionary psychology, the origins of the modern mind and evolution and culture, etc. We are also bringing in biology here, and part, of course, of some of the things discussed in those lectures, plus the biosemiotic aspect of the cultural studies analysis of biology. Okay, so we saw that the main debate in biology is that between nature and nurture, or nature and culture, and we saw that it is better to adopt a methodological holism where studying biology, okay, and bringing in the biological element or aspect to cultural studies should be a non-reductionist one. That is, everything should not be reduced to biology, and we should look at organisms as complex systems where they interact with one another, and there is a systemic context. Okay, that is, the system has a context, and also make room for things like overdetermination, to agree that phenomena or events, even if they are biological events, are also, like physical events, overdetermined. That is, there is a theory of overdetermination where we hold that things or events have more causes than can be or than are, okay, identified by us, by our science and technology. Then we saw that biosemiotics, biology can also be considered a system of signs and codes, okay, where organisms produce and interpret signs. And we also came across a wonderful word, I think, a word like semiosphere, where, like the atmosphere, we have a semiosphere, or a space, if you will, which is which comprises sounds, smells, colors, waves, electric fields, and motion. Fine. So I welcome you once again, okay, to module 4, and I'm sure it will be very, very interesting for you, since we are dealing with media, with culture industry, and forms of culture, including virtual forms, right? So we are going to look today at culture industry, and the key source texts in this lecture are Chris Barker's Cultural Studies, Theory and Practice, Chris Barker's The Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, and Meenakshi Durham and Douglas Kellner's Media and Cultural Studies. Okay. Some of you are, I'm sure, aware of where the term culture industry comes from, right? Those of you who are aware of this term would definitely, be acquainted with two scholars, Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer, right, and their famous work, Dialectic of Enlightenment. The term culture industry, okay, comes from, even if culture was understood perhaps even before them as industry, but the term was well established by them in the discourse of culture, in their essay, the culture industry, enlightenment as mass deception. So what we are going to do, we are, this lecture is largely largely based on Adorno and Horkheimer's analysis of culture, though towards the end I will point to a critique of such a way of looking at culture. But the fact, if you remember the lecture on development, if you remember the lectures on globalization, we saw that culture may be considered an economic good. Okay, we saw how, not simply metaphorically, culture is also an economic good, being very much a part of the market, right? So here culture is seen as an industry, and in the work by Adorno and Horkheimer, okay, we shall see what such an industry, okay, involving mass culture and mass consumption does to the consumer. You will recall that in module 3 we already looked at consumption. I think there were 2 lectures devoted to consumption, and here in industry some of those points may also be recalled by us as we look at culture as industry. Fine. Now Horkheimer and Adorno have admitted to the fact that the term culture industry, okay, is analogous to terms like mass culture, okay, popular culture. They said that we could have used the terms that were in currency like mass culture and popular culture, but to highlight the fact that culture works like an industry, or that culture is, and mass culture particularly is an industry, they use the term or they prefer the term culture industry. Okay, so you may also apply the same thing as you discuss mass culture and popular culture, right? Now, their work, particularly this piece of work, deals with cultural economies, okay, with mass production, and a very important term here is that of mass deception. Okay, so throughout this lecture, I hope to show you how consumers of mass culture, of popular culture, are sort of deceived. That's the term. Are sort of deceived, okay, by the culture industry. Okay. The first, or the main focus of culture industry and the whole discourse of culture industries, okay, is for us to understand, right, that culture industries are, after all, in the service of capitalism. Okay, so if you recall that we talked about Marxism in module 1, I think, when we are talking about theories. I think 2 lectures were devoted to Marxism, if I remember. And we find that capitalism is an economic and political social arrangement, okay, where the onus is on capital, where the onus is on private profit, where the onus is on surplus, right? We will not go into capitalism in detail here, but the point being made by Adorno and Horkheimer, okay, and other people who are in this discourse of the culture industry, is that, like other industries, okay, the culture industry is also in the service of capitalism, and it perpetuates the capitalist ethos, okay, and that is, it shows in its various manifestations that the capitalist ethos or way of life and way of production, distribution and consumption is, the attempt is to show it as a naturalized one, okay. So it is not simply in our social arrangements and political arrangements, but also, we may say, in our cultural arrangements, that we find that even, cultural forms, like various forms of culture industries, for instance, media, for instance, films, right? These, as Adorno and Horkheimer say, films, radio, television, okay, all these cultural forms, even art, okay, these try to see to it that the capitalist system is well and alive, that it is going strong. So it is, in the words uses are, it is in the service, the culture industry is in the service of the capitalist ethos or of capitalism. So, when Adorno wrote the essay Culture Industry Reconsidered, okay, so he revised some, or some of the points that were made in the dialectic of enlightenment. He puts this beautifully. He says, that is, in a capitalist system, the customer is not king, right, as the culture industry would have us believe, not its subject but its object. Let's look at this again. Okay, we may think that in the process of consuming, just like as we saw in the process of eating out, for instance, in the cultural practice of eating out, okay, in similar way we find that we may feel that as a customer, as a consumer, okay, of cultural goods, of media goods, that we have choice. We are, so to speak, as it says, we are the kings and queens in this domain, and we are being served by the culture industry, all the forms in the culture industry. But Adorno makes this very important point, and that it is actually that the consumer has been made the object, or we may also use the term target here. The consumer is the target. And not the king, not somebody who is being served according to his own good, right, or according to his benefit. The point is that the customer is not a subject, in the sense that the customer is not an agent here. It is the object, or it is the target of the cultural industries, right. So by now you know what, I'm sure you have an idea of where this discussion is going to go. Fine. Adorno and Horkheimer belong to what we call what is known as the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and there was a very important, very powerful impact, okay, of Marxist theory here. And Adorno and Horkheimer are known as Marxists in a sense which may not be, a classical sort of Marxism, which be a revisionist kind of Marxism, but we have to understand that these terms like reification, false consciousness, commodity fetishism, ideology and hegemony, these Marxist terms are very well, applicable, or are very conducive to an understanding of culture industry as put forward by Adorno and Horkheimer. More of this in the next lecture, when we devote an entire lecture to the commodity as a cultural form. Fine. Now, the next important point that has been made by, or we can discuss on the culture industry and what it does to us is this, okay, that there is a certain uniformity, right. There is instead of a healthy heterogeneity, okay, there is a certain uniformity. At least this is what is sought to be, or this is what is the aim, okay, of a culture industry, of cultural forms that are in the service of capitalism, that tries to perpetuate capitalism and that tries to show the ethos of capitalism as something that is a natural one, that is, in a way, it is all but natural that things should be, in that order, right. So culture here, okay, the word used here is infects, okay, you can see some, the analogy to a disease, right. Culture infects everything. Now let's look at this slide here. Culture infects, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, culture infects everything with sameness, with standardization, with regulation, and finally with deception. Now, what kind of culture are we talking about? We are talking here about, please remember this is important. We are talking here about mass culture, about popular culture, okay? Cultural forms that are consumed by the masses, which are, say, forms that are popular, right? Of course, popular culture can be defined in more formal terms, but for our purpose here, it is important to note that culture industry as mass culture and popular culture is something that sort of infects us or injects into, into our cultural ambience, okay, or environment, a certain degree of sameness, okay, of standardization and of regulation. This may be seen in terms of being deceived by the culture industry. When you think as a consumer, as a customer, that what you are consuming or what you're purchasing, or what you are, even intellectual goods, okay, what you are what you are partaking of, right, even as intellectual goods are concerned, okay, you may think that there is a certain uniqueness to it, right, and you think that this is something that will give you or contribute to your identity formation, okay. You take these things, these cultural forms, and you are sort of, you even take pride in the fact that you have made certain choices, okay. But the critics in this school say quite the opposite. They say that we are being deceived. Why? Because underlying this is actually a whole reality of sameness, of standardization, and where our desires and our what should we say, and our responses are already regulated, okay, by a culture industry which is in the service of a capitalist system or a capitalistic ethos. Okay. Now, since I have already said that this is our chief text, we are now going to read a bit from Adorno and Horkheimer's essay, The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception. Okay, let's begin. All mass culture under monopoly is identical. This is important, okay. We have to sort of alert ourselves, okay, as we consume culture, okay, mass culture, that all forms of mass culture are really identical, and the contours of its skeleton, the conceptual armature fabricated by monopoly, are beginning to stand out, right. So this is something which Adorno and Horkheimer say are something that will not be concealed, okay, for long. Why? Why is it beginning to stand out or show itself? This is because, let's read on, those in charge no longer, let's underline this, those in charge no longer take much trouble to conceal the structure, okay. Look at this. At least one would have thought that in this whole process of deceiving, at least where we are deceived, there are attempts made by the capitalist system, and by a monopolistic system. There are attempts, at least we think, that would be made to conceal the fact that we are being deceived, to conceal the fact that things have been made so rampantly identical, so enormously, hugely identical, okay. So, but they say that those who are in charge of the culture industries are even now no longer, okay, trying to even hide the fact, even conceal the fact or conceal the structure behind their enterprises. Then they say the power of which increases the more bluntly its existence is admitted, okay. So there is a certain a certain bluntness about things. There is no concealing, okay, in this whole deceiving enterprise, an enterprise of deceiving the masses, okay, in producing mass culture and producing cultural forms that are so identical, so repetitive, infused with sameness. All these things are no longer, even there is not even an attempt of the culture industry to hide its structures, and there is a blunt, okay, there is a blunt, so to say, exhibition of their forms. Then let's read on. Films and radio no longer need to represent or present themselves as art, right. The truth that they are nothing but business. They're nothing but business is used as an ideology to legitimize, okay, the trash. Look at the word, powerful word here, really, the trash they intentionally produce. So this is almost, you can very well imagine, or you can even draw the analogy to commodity, actual commodity production, okay, to assembly line production even, right, where mass goods are produced, material goods are produced for consumption. So also here, okay, cultural goods and forms are produced in what would be a very direct and bluntly identical manner, where things, as they say here, even things like films and radio, which are considered to be art, okay, which are things that are to be thought out, okay, before they are presented to the public, which has to be presented in a certain degree of sophistication and complexity that we expect from good art. He says that they say that films and radio are also, it is no longer felt even that you present these cultural forms as art. Okay, let me give you an example. I'm sure a clear example, you will agree here, a clear example here are certain types of Bollywood movies, certain types of Bollywood romances, or well, even probably certain types of crime thrillers that are produced by the film industry in our country. Look at also the soaps, for instance, there are some, so many soaps which are so identical both in presentation and in theme and content. Okay, so we I'm sure some of us have even wondered how we don't even know which sort of soap we are in. Okay, they are so similar, the situations are similar, the dialogues are similar, right? And some of us us also perhaps have wondered how these kind or different, these soaps that are so identical, that these films, movies that are so identical are being produced continually. Okay, so there is a certain, if I may use the word, a thoughtlessness behind it. Why? And the reason that Adorno and Horkheimer identify is this. Okay, the reason is that this is business, right, and not art, and you don't even have to make an attempt to hide the fact that here supposedly art forms that are supposedly to do with art are being turned into business. Now, when they are turned into business for mass consumption, there is bound to be a certain homogeneity about these things. Okay, they are bound to be things that are identical. So the truth that they are nothing but business is used as an ideology, is used as a worldview, okay, to legitimize the trash that they are intentionally producing. Right, so they are not answerable. That is, we may explain it in that sense. They are not answerable to the public, to the very public that consumes these things. Okay. Then we shall read on again. The standardized forms, it is claimed, were originally derived from the needs of the consumers. Okay, so at first it was claimed that, well, consumers need these things. Consumers need certain themes. Consumers need for certain ways of presenting, okay, content. Okay, so these standardized forms, it is claimed, were originally derived from the needs of the consumers. That is why they are accepted with so little resistance. Okay. Now again, let's look at what we call the famous Saas Bahu serials, for instance, right? So there is the initial argument to be made by the culture industry, by the proponents of the culture industry, this kind of industry, is that these are needed, consumers want these, and that is why we are presenting it, no matter how identical these are. Okay, as long as they need it, we are going to produce these things even if they are identical. So the standardized forms are, the whole argument behind it is that they are derived from the needs of the consumers. That is why they are accepted with so little resistance. But Adorno and Horkheimer point out what actually is happening is that look at this, in reality, a cycle, they call it, a cycle of manipulation and retroactive need is unifying the system. Okay, where they show that Actually, people want these products, people want them in a certain format, in a certain language, if you will, right? They want it over and over again. The reality, as has been pointed out by Adorno and Horkheimer, is that this is really manipulation of the very audience that it purports to serve, right? So in reality, a cycle of manipulation and retroactive need is unifying the system ever more tightly. What is not mentioned is that the basis on which technology is gaining power over society is the power of those whose economic position in society is the strongest. Okay, so in a way, it's like saying, in the common parlance that we say, that they are the ones who are laughing their way to the bank. Okay, so those whose, as far as this technology is gaining power, okay, this technology also belongs to the ones who have whose economic position in society is strongest. Again, relate this to Marxism, relate this to the classical version of, if I may use the word, Marxism that we had discussed in the first module, right? So what are the terms that we have after having been through the words of Adorno and Horkheimer in their essay, is that ideologies are therefore predetermined. You may think that you have a certain ideology, and remember, what is an ideology? Let's go back again to our lectures. Ideologies are ways of looking at the world. They are lenses of looking at the world. Okay, an ideology is a worldview that you hold, and your actions are also going to be, we believe, motivated by the ideology that we hold. And we believe wrongly, erroneously, okay, this kind of analysis would tell us, we believe erroneously that our ideologies, our worldviews are ours, are uniquely ours, are singularly ours, but that is not the fact. The fact is the culture industry predetermines the ideologies that you are going to hold, okay, and therefore logically, it also predetermines the actions that you are going to perform, the decisions that you are going to make as far as your life, your living, your cultural practices are concerned. Okay, so we need to take heed, even as we consume, even as we enjoy, even as we find these mass culture goods, okay, and forms, even if we find them pleasurable, we have to also go behind the scenes, as it were, and understand and grasp this very important political aspect, okay, that ideologies are predetermined by the culture industry as far as the mass culture goes. Okay, so we also then see it, let's look at this slide please, we see it in terms of a manipulation. We see it as if we are being manipulated, right? Our ideologies are manipulated, our worldviews are manipulated, our aesthetics are manipulated, and eventually perhaps our relationships with one another, our social relationships, our personal relationships, our professional relationships are also being manipulated and decided, sort of pre-decided, okay, by somebody else. This means that there is, of course, social control. There is a great degree of social control by the mass media and its forms. Okay. Finally, therefore, the world that is presented before us by the mass media, by the culture industries, forms of the culture industries, is an illusory world. Okay. The more we partake of these forms and products, the more we live in a world of illusion. This is really kind of commodity fetishism, right, which we will discuss in the next lecture when we talk about the commodity. Okay, but the fact is, the mass media is very powerful in this, and in the sense it can also create a world of illusion. Why? Why is the world of illusion? How is it created? By constant repetition. Okay, by constant repetition, by sameness, by producing identical things, okay, almost in an assembly line fashion, where by using these things repeatedly in their sameness and in their identicalness, if I may use the word, Okay, we are being deceived, we are being manipulated, and we are being illusioned. Such is, so strong is the argument that is provided by the proponents of the term the culture industry, particularly as given to us by Adorno and Horkheimer. Right. So what happens in this case? Just a while ago we saw that ideologies are predetermined. We are being manipulated, we live increasingly in an illusionary world, and there is tremendous social control by culture industries over us. What does this ultimately lead to? This leads to the maintenance of social hierarchies. Okay, so if there is no critique, if there is no resistance, remember the point being made by Adorno and Horkheimer, there's very little resistance, okay, because consumers are made to think that this is what you want, and we are being sort of loyal and faithful to you. We are giving you what you want. Cultural forms are things that you want. When there is very little resistance, and when there is the consuming of cultural forms, be it movies, television serials, or any other cultural form, there is the social hierarchy under a capitalist system, which is an exploitative one, is maintained, it is perpetuated, right? So remember one of the initial slides that we saw, what was the point made? That the culture industries are largely in the service of capitalism, in the maintenance and perpetuation of a capitalist hierarchical exploitative ethos, right? So first point we get is there's a maintenance of social hierarchy. Second is there is a consent to the order, right? The more you consume these goods, these cultural forms, okay, there is a consent, and then which term are we going to use from Marxism? We are going to use the term hegemony, if you remember, okay. There is a hegemony which is translated by many as manufactured consent, okay. This consent is something that we give with perhaps increasingly very little resistance in some people, very little resistance to the goods that are being doled out to us by the culture industry. So there is a consent to the order. Which order? There is a consent to not simply the cultural order and the cultural forms. There is a consent. To eventually it means that there is a consent to the socio-political order, which is the capitalist order. Okay, so without knowing, okay, through the consumption, through we would say an unproblematized consumption of the forms of culture industries, okay, through these, the capitalist order is being maintained and retained. Okay, finally, there is an acceptance from a purely cultural studies perspectives. How would we articulate it? We would say that there is an acceptance of the signs, the signifying practices, the codes that are being given to us, by the culture industries. Okay, culture industries and their forms are also signifying practices. Why? Because they encode reality for us in certain ways, and particularly through this very powerful tool known as called sameness. Powerful tool of things being identical. Okay, what happens is, the codes, the fact that signs and codes are, there's an encoding, and we decode them according to the way, the system wants us to decode them. These become sort of naturalized, right? And we forget that these were in fact social and cultural constructions in the first place. These are not innocuous constructions. These are constructions that add to a system, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, a system that is fundamentally exploitative in nature. Okay. Then we read further, okay, and we look at the term entertainment as has been understood by Adorno and Horkheimer in their essay, The Culture Industry. Okay. So they shed a very different light on the way we understand entertainment. Okay, entertainment, we go for movies, for instance, we watch television, or we have various forms of entertainment. Okay, they very radically forward this point, that entertainment is the prolongation of work under late capitalism. Okay, common sense tells us, okay, commonsensical views of entertainment tell us that entertainment is escape from work. Okay, after a hard day's work, you go home, or a hard day's, day full of classes and lab work, you go to your hostel and you watch your movie, and in order to, or you engage in, in forms of entertainment. Media, I'm talking about mass culture entertainment here, and you would think that, well, I'm moving away from work. But Adorno and Horkheimer say that entertainment is a prolongation of work under late capitalism. Let's see how. Entertainment is sought by those who want to escape the mechanized labor process. Okay, let's read this again. It is sought by those who want to escape the mechanized labor process so that they can cope with it again. Okay, so I want to peruse these, or I want to use these cultural forms, because all this while I have been engaged in a very mechanized sort of a labor, very repetitive, okay, so that I can be refreshed, so to speak, okay, and I can come back to my so-called mechanized labor, mechanized work. But Adorno and Horkheimer say no. Okay, they say that we shouldn't forget that at the same time, however, mechanization has such power over leisure and its happiness, determines so thoroughly the fabrication of entertainment commodities, that the off-duty worker can experience nothing but after images of the work process itself. Let's read this again. At the same time, okay, mechanization in the labor process, for instance, has such power over leisure and the happiness that it produces. And mechanization in the mass culture or the culture industry determines what they call the fabric of entertainment commodities. Technology, we call technological domination, okay, technological rationality, or even an instrumental rationality, through technology, okay, creates a fabric, or creates the whole tenor or the whole content, theme, presentation of what they call entertainment commodities, that what they call the off-duty worker, that is the worker who is in search of entertainment as a distraction, is actually really continuing the labor process, the mechanized labor process, which they call the after images of the work process itself. Okay, so this is very different from, as I said again, very different from the commonsensical way of understanding entertainment. Entertainment and the mechanized labor process under capitalism of a technological rationality are not different. They are, both are produced by the same logic of technological of domination. Okay, this is something that is immensely important as we read Adorno and Horkheimer. Then they continue this point, and I'm reading their words. The only escape from the work process in factory and office is through adaptation to it in leisure time. Okay, so you're only adapting to it, and your leisure time is nothing but the prolongation or an extension of your work process. This is they call it, and they use very strong words, this is the incurable sickness of all entertainment. Okay, where entertainment should have refreshed us, where entertainment should have given us food for thought, should have distracted us in a very healthy sense, okay, should have taken us away from mechanized labor processes. They say that entertainment itself become sort of sicklied, okay, and they call it an incurable sickness, sicklied with the very logic of technological domination. Amusement, let's read on. Amusement congeals into boredom, since to be amusement it must cost no effort, and therefore moves strictly along the well-worn grooves of association. This is, again, you have to associate this, or you have to relate this to terms like sameness and identity, replicability. Everything is following the same logic. The spectator must need no thoughts of his own. Okay, so there is really where entertainment should have given you food for thought, should have given you healthy distraction, you sort of become consumers who don't need to do any work. Okay, why? After all, because it is a prolongation of your own work process. Okay, so you sit back and it is again repeated, that mechanized labor and that domination, the logic of technological domination is in its entire, in this thorough boredom, okay, where amusement should have, true amusement should have been, in this thorough boredom, demands no mental work from you, in the sense that it demands no thinking, at least demands no creative thinking on your part. Okay, so let's read on. The spectator must need no thoughts of his own. The product prescribes, look at this beautiful word here, prescribes each reaction. That is the reaction that, even the reaction that you're going to have, okay, towards a cultural form, towards these entertainment forms, is also something that is prescribed. So you will react to it, you'll respond to it, okay, according to the way. So even the responses are being determined beforehand. So the spectator must need no thoughts of his own. The product prescribes each reaction, not through any actual adherence, but through signals. Okay, so the product prescribes the reaction through its signs and codes. Any logical connection presupposing mental capacity is scrupulously avoided. We note the very strong sarcasm in the words of Adorno and Horkheimer. Then the example is given here from cartoons and stunt films. Okay, and a lot of work is also currently going on the representation process in cartoons, in even in stunt films, for instance. And there is a very interesting point being made here, is that is initially, if you looked at cartoon films, what was the motive? The motive was that the cartoon films provide you flights of fantasy, okay, from rationalism. There is pure rationality is something that we cannot live with definitely all the time. Okay, we cannot live as purely sort of logical beings, symbol manipulating beings all the time. We are beings that emote, we have our emotional lives, our desires, okay, our feelings, our sentiments. So cartoon films were initially, we enjoyed them as flights from fantasy, right? Flights of fantasy from almost a repressive rationality. But what is happening today, and let's look at the slides. See, initially where there were flights of fantasy from rationalism, today there is a restraining of individual resistance. Okay, so that even these cartoon films, the stunt films, are immensely predictable. Right? They are no longer, they are still within, this is the point they make, they are still within the structure, okay, they're still within the structure of rationalism, of technological rationalism, so that, even when I watch cartoon films, increasingly I find them to be boring. Why? Because they are simply, the technology is the same, the repetition is the same, the voiceovers are the same. I'm not talking about very excellent animation films, but I would say that even these excellent animation films perhaps run the risk of such sameness and identicalness, right? So where there should have been healthy flights of fantasy, today we find that there is no resistance. Okay, there is no resistance to the technological order being given by these cartoon films or these stunt films. Okay, they again become a prolongation or extension of the very mechanized labor we are all trying to escape from. So therefore, there is a cultural dumbing down, okay, the cultural dumbing down, as one critic has put it. There is a colonization of leisure by the culture industry, right? However, I like to end with this point before we move on to the discussion. It's not that there are no critiques of this discourse of culture, of this discourse of cultural forms, media forms, mass culture forms, and these advocates of the other way of looking at culture industry also say that, well, it is not that resistance doesn't happen, okay. it is not that everyone capitulates to the capitalist order. It's not that there is no resistance, and it's not that there is no attempt made by filmmakers, by media people who produce media forms to sensitize people to this very rationale of technological domination. They also say that that we have to admit, instead of putting everything within this theoretical framework, we also have to admit that there is a great deal of diversity. There's a great deal of diversity, diverse themes, diverse techniques that are which are being produced, and as we get the various opportunities to have dialogues with other cultures, to look at their cultural forms, there is a diversity which resists this process of mechanized labor and the extension of labor, right? So we end on this note, on this positive note of where it is, we begin to say that it's possible for us not to be just passive consumers and to have our reactions and choices prescribed by the culture industry. So let's go to the discussion and just one or two questions. What are the chief arguments of the culture industry discourse? The chief argument is that, one, that culture industries are eventually in the service of a capitalist ethos, and all the forms being produced by the culture industries only perpetuate a capitalist ethos and try and attempt to show these things as natural. And they also, secondly, that culture infects everything with sameness, with standardization, regulation, which eventually deceive those who consume its products. Remember, this is in the case of mass culture. Mass culture produce the same goods, identical goods, and there is standardization even in an assembly line sort of way. There is a regulation of both our choices and our responses through signals, through signs and codes, which ultimately end up to be a deception of the consumer. So we therefore eventually have predetermined ideologies and social control illusion, etc. There is a cultural dumbing down and a colonization of. The last question: how may leisure and entertainment be conceptualized within this argument given by Adorno and Horkheimer and others of this school? Is that entertainment is seen as a prolongation of work, where because of the logic of technological domination, and the off-duty worker experiences really nothing but after images of the work process itself. And even in supposedly powerful media like cartoon films and stunt films, which we saw as resistance to such a domination, are no longer flights of fantasy, and there is no longer any resistance. They are not channels of resistance. And to be entertainment means therefore to be in agreement, and entertainment makes itself possible only by insulating itself, in the words of Adorno and Horkheimer, from the totality of the social process. And amusement always means putting things out of mind, forgetting suffering, even when it is on display. So I hope we after this we have some food for thought, really, and to see how within cultural studies, cultural forms and which are called to be products of, products of the culture industry, may be looked at from a critical angle. Maybe even as we make our choices, these have very powerful lessons for us, not only academically, but also as we lead our lives and we make our choices in entertainment. Perhaps it is desirable that we understand where we are being manipulated, where our choices and also our responses are being prescribed by predetermined ideologies. And we will stop here, and the next lecture, second lecture in the module 4, will be devoted solely to the commodity, because that is the starting point, really. And that is, those of you who are acquainted with Das Kapital, Karl Marx's Das Kapital, will also remember that it is with this most elementary unit, the commodity, with which Marx begins his critique and description of capitalism. Thank you for now.